Dear colleagues and participants, welcome to this C20 session on Debt for Life, sharing the global pandemic burden and responsibility. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the C20, which, as you know, is the civil society engagement mechanism with the group of 20 process and comprises organizations and networks from all over the world, not only from G20 countries, but also beyond G20 countries, to welcome you in these very critical sessions in today's COVID-19 context. So the framing of the question is very clear: debt or life? You know, it tries to raise the debt discussion beyond the normal orthodox economic analysis within which it is often confined, and look at other dimensions, primarily the critical importance that fiscal space have for countries to confront the human rights obligations, their sustainable development agenda, but also in a particular moment like this, to confront it with counter-cyclical measures that can protect their people, their communities in a very challenging set of circumstances. So it's essential that we don't only look at the debt issue from the point of view of its economic determinants and macroprudential determinants, but we frame it in the context of the critical human imperatives that are in front of us. The second important issues that the sessions will also try to look at is that locate debt outside of the case-by-case country context, and look at the systemic determinants that can actually contribute and sometimes even actually determine themselves the levels of debt unsustainability, as well as the emergence of sovereign debt crisis. We have an excellent round of speakers to confront this. It's going to be my pleasure to moderate the session in my capacity as co-chair of the International Financial Architecture Working Group of the CIVIL20. And the structure of the session will be very simple. We will have a first round in which our panelists will be able to articulate their critical concerns in 5 minutes each, and I would invite them to stay within this time. Then we will have a second and third round in which we will pose them some questions. In the second round, I will challenge their perspective with some questions that I will invite them to answer from their respective angles. And then it will be a pleasure to pick some comments and questions from the audience. So I will invite you not to wait for that sort of third round, but already as you hear panelists speaking, to populate the chat with your particular perspective. And then to close, I will invite the panelists for some final concluding remarks. Of course, I hope this will be a fairly interactive session among the panelists, but also with those of you in the audience. So without further ado, let me just get started, and I'm going to go exactly into the first round, providing the floor to our first panelist, Mr. Bandar Alomali, who is the G20 local lead for the International Financial Architecture Working Group and senior advisor at the International Monetary Fund. Bandar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and I would like to thank the C20 for the invitation, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy amid this challenging times. I'm very pleased to be part of this distinguished panel to discuss an important and timely topic about debt sustainability, especially given the magnitude of the current crisis. But let me first, Stefano, congratulate you on the C20 communique, which includes a number of relevant policy recommendations in the context of the current global challenges. I think we will have time to discuss some of these recommendations today, but I'd like to focus my remarks on two main issues. following the guidance you provided in your introductory remarks, the first issue is the immediate response that need to be taken to address the ongoing liquidity challenges during the pandemic. And the second issue is the mid and long-term approaches in the international debt treatments and how to unlock different sources of financing going forward. I think you said it correctly, Stefano, that when we look at the debt sustainability issue, we should not only focus on the vulnerability side, but we should also focus on the financing side. So on the immediate response, there is no doubt that the pressing challenges require emergency policy response to protect life and livelihood, especially in the most vulnerable countries. And here, the response measure taken against the pandemic contributed to avoiding a systemic debt crisis, at least until now. And this is based on the information we received from the IMF, and I'll explain why. So far, 11 trillion US dollar injected into the global economy, and that reflects unprecedented fiscal and monetary policy measures, which are over 4 times than what was provided during the global financial crisis. Also, as you know, the G20 adopted a debt service suspension initiative, which brought together more than 30 official bilateral creditors to agree on a unified term sheet for debt treatments that targets 73 low-income countries. This is unprecedented in modern history by all measures in terms of coordination between official bilateral creditors. This initiative was also supported by the IMF, who provided debt relief to 28 BSSI eligible countries, as well as financial assistance of over 100 billion US dollar to 81 countries, 53 of which are BSSI eligible countries facing the health and economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. Also, I have to highlight that the World Bank and the multilateral development banks are committed to maintain positive flows following the G20 call to those countries over the same suspension period of the BSSI. And here we are talking about 75 billion US dollar over the period between April and December alone, part of their commitment to provide 230 billion US dollar for emerging and low-income countries as a response to the current pandemic. But moving ahead, I believe one of the key policy challenges facing low-income countries is to find the right balance between scaling up public investment and containing debt vulnerability. And so, as we begin to look toward a stronger, more resilient recovery, we need to address the issue of sustaining long-term financing for development, especially given the evolving challenges and the continued uncertainty surrounding the depth and duration of the pandemic. So, building on the emergency responses implemented so far, there is a need, of course, to adapt progressively longer-term structural approaches with a view to, one, address the remaining issues in the international debt agenda, including through strengthening coordination among official bilateral creditors and promoting best practices in the area of sovereign debt management, and two, unlock different sources of financing for low-income countries beyond debt. But of course, each country requires different solution when we talk about the structural approaches, and thus the application of these structural approaches require a consideration of country-specific circumstance or case-by-case approach. But most importantly, the success of the implementation of both the short-term and long-term measures require firm commitment to multilateralism and global collaboration. And I believe the unprecedented joint measures implemented this year by the G20 and the relevant international financial institution reflect a high spirit of cooperation that we will remain reliant on, of course, as we continue to implement the longer term development agenda. So let me stop here, and I will be, of course, happy to react to any additional issues.
Thank you so much, Bander. And let me also use this opportunity, because you have been our counterpart in the Civil 20 IFA working group process, for the continuous dialogue and the very, very close collaboration that we had this year, which I think have been very, very welcome as an opportunity to always keep our channel open as we went through very, very critical and complex circumstances. So a special appreciation for your constant support in that respect. But let me now, we'll come back to you for the second round, but in the meantime, it's excellent to move on with our list of speakers, and I'm gonna now move the floor to a very close friend and companion in our struggles, Lidi Nakpil, coordinator of the Asia People's Movement on Debt and Development. Lidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano, and good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are located in the world. I know we have just a short time in this opening round, and I would like to just emphasize three things. The first, I think, is a point that has been said often enough, but we cannot emphasize it enough, that the debt relief that is actually on the table, if you look at it in terms of the scale of need and the urgency, is really very small. A pittance, someone has described it, and involves too few countries. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we have at this period, that we are now raising the calls for bolder and wider and deeper actions on the debt. And I'm not going to talk about numbers here. I'm just going to talk about what I believe is a very narrow, very short-sighted, even flawed framework on which this debt relief is based. And that is what is actually biased in favor of the creditors or the lender's point of view. After all the discussions we've had been participating in, it's quite clear that their basis for defining who needs debt cancellation or debt relief is countries' ability to pay the debts on time and in full. So you are in debt distress or in a debt crisis if you're not able to make your payments, or you're at risk of not being able to make your payments. And these are the countries that are being considered for debt relief. It's not talking about the scale of need in terms of the finance in order to respond to the multiple crises we are all facing. The second point, I think, that they're considering as a major point is the question of whether countries are able to get other forms of financing in terms of loans. And this was made very clear in the town hall meeting we had with Kristalina yesterday, when she was saying that other countries don't need this debt relief because they can secure loans, especially from the private sector. So that's really indicative of, I think, the very flawed, very narrow and short-sighted basis for what they believe as need for debt relief. The second point is also of major concern, and this relates to the last point that I made, that the basis for debt relief is whether countries can avail themselves of other forms of finance, and especially loans. And this is our concern, that actually COVID-19 is not generating debt relief. It's actually generating new conditions for a huge wave of debt crisis in the next few years. Because what we have is more money, lots more money being lent than money being canceled, than debt relief or debts being canceled. So just for the multilateral development banks alone, we're talking about more than $200 billion that is being lent to countries like the Philippines, as compared to, say, the $12 billion that constitute debt cancellation and debt suspension payments. The third point I'd like to make is that, I've been working on this issue for about at least 3 decades, and I don't believe that we have actually progressed that much in terms of the international community's understanding and response to the debt. And what we're calling for, which is just as immediate as debt relief, is more systemic understanding and analysis of the problem, and therefore more systemic solutions. I'd just like to end there because I know we have time to discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydie, for your thoughtful and always straight to the point intervention, which I think raises really the bar of our discussion here. And let me move on with our third panelist before we engage into, I would say, a lot of also responses among the different panelists. And therefore, let me give the floor to another good friend, Sarah Jane Clifton, the director of the Jubilee Debt Campaign in the UK. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano. And hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Jane Clifton, Director of Jubilee Debt Campaign. We're a UK charity working to tackle poverty caused by unjust debt. I'm going to focus on the question of private sector participation in debt relief in response to COVID. But before I do that, I want to make just a couple of general points. First of all, we believe it's entirely unacceptable that developing countries are having to, in the face of such a destructive global pandemic, are having to choose between making debt payments and investing in their health systems and in social protection. We've heard lots of figures already, but I'll cite another one at you. So according to Oxfam, currently $2.8 billion are leaving developing countries, those countries that are eligible for the DSSI, every month. That's $92 million a day in debt payments. This is at a time when, as the World Bank has said this week, extreme poverty is set to rise globally for the first time since 1998. And it's at a time when rich countries like my country, the UK, the US, the European countries are shoring up our economies with trillions of dollars of cash injection in terms of public spending and in terms of quantitative easing. Now, these are tools which developing countries simply don't have available to them, and therefore they are having to make this choice, this very hard choice between debt payments and healthcare, and that's entirely unacceptable. Second, we believe it's essential that this time around the IMF, the World Bank and the G20 don't make the same mistakes that they made in relation to the last big debt crisis in the Global South in the 1980s and 1990s. A mistake which involved dragging their feet on debt cancellation, bailing out reckless lenders, and basically letting the debt crisis spiral further out of control, so that when the action which was needed was finally taken, it had to be taken much deeper and was much harder and more complex. We obviously believe that the IMF should be commended for the quick action on the debt cancellation for the CCRT countries, and also the G20 for moving promptly on the DSSI. But as Lydie said, these measures are dramatically insufficient. The DSSI does not tackle the underlying problem of unsustainable debt. It's basically a pretend and extend measure, and it simply lays the ground for a much bigger debt crisis mid-decade. In terms of actually what we believe needs to happen, we really need to see the G20 move urgently from suspension of debt payments to cancellation of debt payments, at least 4 years worth of debt payments, both for the DSSI countries, but also for other lower middle income and middle income countries that need it, which aren't currently eligible, but those which do face big debt crises and also which have significant proportions of their population who are in poverty. We think it's essential that the G20 and the IMF and World Bank all take responsibility for compelling cancellation of private sector debt payments. It's obviously totally immoral that actors that have made significant profits from this debt crisis, I'm talking about a debt crisis which was already emerging before COVID, that they should get paid in full. We believe that debt is a shared responsibility between lenders and borrowers, and that means that lenders, particularly those that have behaved recklessly, should also take a hit. we think it's essential that the private sector does take responsibility for their role in this debt crisis. And the last 6 months have shown that they're not prepared to do that voluntarily. So we need the G20 and the World Bank and IMF to use the tools and measures available to them to compel private sector participation. Otherwise, any money which is used either through the DSSI's debt suspension or debt cancellation is simply going to be used to bail out private lenders. There are lots of tools available. The IMF has its own rules, actually, which say that a debt restructuring should take place in a country before the IMF will lend to it. Those are rules which it doesn't tend to follow, and it hasn't been following in relation to its emergency financing for countries in the context of COVID. There's a precedent here in the UK for legislation to prevent lenders from suing countries that cancel debt payments as part of multilateral debt restructuring processes. That's an indirect way of incentivizing participation from the private sector, which could easily be enacted here in the UK and in New York, which together cover about 90% of private debts to developing country governments. And then the IMF has powers under Article 8 also to temporarily suspend the enforceability of debt contracts. So there's no shortage of tools. What we're seeing is that the G20 and the IFAs are not currently prepared to use those tools. And so they're essentially letting the private lenders off the hook, bailing them out, which is untenable, we believe, in this context and needs to be corrected. So to conclude, I'd just like to make one final point, and that's that we also believe it's important that the World Bank and IMF, as major lenders themselves, participate in the cancellation of debt payments owed to them. The IMF has already obviously done something, but we think it needs to go further, and we think the World Bank also needs to participate in debt cancellation. We hear this argument from both institutions that they need their gold and cash reserves in order to maintain their credit ratings, in order to be able to lend, to give emergency financing to countries in the context of COVID. The bank has argued that if it joins the DSSI, then this would make it less able to borrow at low interest rates and then for lend in response. I'm sorry, but we simply don't believe that these arguments stack up. Both for the bank and for the fund, they are both financially backed by rich country governments, which themselves are so trusted now by the financial sector that they can currently borrow at close to 0% or even at negative interest rates. And at the same time, we've seen quantitative easing and the flight to safety by speculators, essentially leading to a huge demand for safe debt guaranteed by rich country governments, which includes the debt which is issued or which is taken on by the World Bank and the IMF. So we believe it's entirely possible for both institutions to draw down on their big cash reserves that they've made from profits, basically from lending to developing countries, and from their gold, which has dramatically increased in value during the context of the pandemic, to fund debt cancellation of debt payments that are owed to them. I'll leave it there for now. I've got some more to say on the question of credit ratings and market access, but I'll leave that for later in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And certainly, yes, it's going to be great to pick up the issue of credit rating, which is currently an entirely private run exercise, which very often compromises the public's institutions' ability to actually pursue their objectives. So I would welcome that conversation to be picked up in the dialogue. And I'm pretty sure also Bander has something to say about it, because there's been quite some engagement with in trying to dialogue, at least with credit rating agencies, that it's interesting to reflect on what has emerged and what has clearly showed us some limitations of that. But before we get to that, let me continue with our list of speakers. Our next intervention will be from Mr. A.M. Koze, the director of the World Bank Prospects Group. So A.M., please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me. It's great to be here to discuss this important topic. I'm going to focus on three issues today, and eventually I will get to the kind of the debt issue, discuss that. I very much appreciate the views expressed so far. I think we will have a vibrant conversation. The first one is about the backdrop we have. How deep is this global recession? We really need to understand the depth of the recession. Our current projections suggest that the pandemic recession will be the deepest global recession since the Second World War. And the recession is unique for at least two reasons. First, it is the only episode, at least since 1870, to have been triggered solely by a pandemic and the actions taken to contain it. Second, our current forecast suggests that in 2020, the highest share of economies will experience contractions in per capita GDP since 1870. For emerging market developing economies, the recession has been also very deep. In fact, it marked the first contraction of these economies experienced as a group since at least 1960. These recessions are expected to increase global poverty anywhere between 88 billion to 115 billion this year. For the first time since 1998, global extreme poverty will increase in 2020. As Sarah already mentioned, we released our report on this last week. Let me turn to the second question. Against this background, there are serious risks confronting emerging and developing economies. The first one, of course, is the more protracted pandemic. But the second one is the risk of financial crisis amid high debt levels. Given the issue we are discussing here, let me focus on the debt-related risks. Even before the pandemic, we were experiencing a record-breaking debt wave that started in 2010, and it already saw the largest, fastest, and most broad-based increase in debt in emerging markets in the past 50 years. The average annual increase in debt in emerging market and developing economies since 2010 of almost 7 percentage points of GDP has been substantially larger than in the previous waves of debt. In 2019, government debt was about 52%. It will be more than 64% in 2021. Among other countries, these are the world's poorest countries, external financing needs are expected to increase to roughly 6% of GDP in 2020 from just 1% in 2019. We have seen that the poorest countries are hit particularly hard. Many of them have insufficient capacity to generate revenues and have therefore little room to cover needed expenditures without increasing borrowing. And with revenues further decreasing due to the pandemic, the cost of servicing debt is eating up an even bigger share of revenues. Let me turn to the third question, what we have been doing in the context of these serious debt challenges. To take a first step toward debt relief for the poorest countries, at the World Bank spring meetings in March, the World Bank and the IMF proposed a moratorium on debt payments by the poorest countries. It was partly a response to COVID and the need for countries to have fiscal space, and also a recognition that a debt crisis was underway for the poorest countries. With the endorsement by the G20, G7, and the Paris Club, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the SSI, took effect on May 1st. It enabled a fast and coordinated response to provide additional fiscal space for the poorest countries in the world. As of September, 40 more countries were benefiting from estimated 5 billion in debt service suspension from official bilateral creditors, complementing the scaled-up emergency financing provided by the bank and the fund. The SSI has also enabled us to make significant progress on debt transparency, an issue I am hoping we will discuss today. And debt transparency is also critical because it will help borrowing countries and their creditors make more informed borrowing and investment decisions. This year's edition of the World Bank's International Debt Statistics, to be released next Monday, October 12th, and I'm sure this is the type of publication the audience and panelists will be interested, will provide more detail and more disaggregated data on sovereign debt than ever before in our nearly 70-year history. By mid next year, the World Bank will provide more than $20 billion in financing to the poorest countries. And we are supporting the G20 and other bilateral creditors in implementing the debt service suspension initiative. There is no question, many more steps are needed on debt relief. One avenue is to broaden and extend the current debt initiative so that there is time to work out a more permanent solution. The bank and the fund have called on to the G20 to extend the DSSI relief through the end of 2021. And we are highlighting the need for G20 governments to urge the participation of all their private and bilateral public sector creditors in the DSSI. Private creditors and non-participating bilateral creditors should not be allowed to free ride on the debt relief of others and at the expense of the world's poor. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very good intervention. And it's also interesting, because if we look at past crises, sometimes very, let's say, over-optimistic projections have actually not helped addressing particularly the systemic roots and therefore the need for urgent systemic reform. So it's quite interesting that you bring us this not very exciting in many respects, but rather challenging picture. And because sometimes we also have the impression that within Bretton Woods institution, there is a little bit of over-optimism with respect to how quickly the global economy is going to be able to come out, of the current deep crisis. So I'm sure this will be another element that will be discussed in the next round. But before we do that, let me move on with our last intervention in our sequence. Another very close friend and partner in crime in co-facilitating the civil society FFD group in the lead up to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, Addis Ababa Conference on FFD. Let me introduce you, Jean Saldagna, the director of the European Network on Debt and Development, also always known as Eurodad. Jean, always a pleasure to be with you, and floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Stefano. And indeed, it is a pleasure to, again, share a platform with you. So I would like to start with responding to a question, actually, or a point for reflection that you had shared with us to consider in our opening presentations, Stefano, about the critical importance of fiscal space for countries' abilities to meet their human rights obligations and the SDGs, looking specifically at counter-cyclical impacts. Unfortunately, right now, obviously, there has been a lot and very commendable efforts, but what we have found is that looking specifically at the current situation, it's precisely doing the opposite. I'd like to specifically point to a recent report, and I think it'll be shared with the audience, the report Arrested Development that we came out with last week, in which we reviewed IMF staff reports for 80 countries, prepared as part of the process of approval for financial assistance between March and September of this year. And what we found was, and this is concerning, developing countries are about to embark on an unprecedented and synchronized exercise in fiscal consolidation. Now, 72 countries are expected to begin such a process as early as next year, when we know that we will still be in the middle of a big health, social, and economic crisis, with austerity measures to be implemented by all 80 countries by 2023. Between 2021 and 2023, these countries will implement austerity measures worth an average of around 3.8% of GDP. Now, this adjustment will be front-loaded, and this will probably leave hardly any time for them to recover their energies and their resources to focus on recovery. The adjustment will probably be equivalent of 2% of GDP, which will take place in 2021. Now, the scale, the speed, and the reach of this adjustment really raises considerable response, not only on the impact at the country level and its impact particularly on the most vulnerable, but also on global growth prospects. We are really concerned about its impacts on poverty and inequality, and the fact that it will overall undermine the achievement of economic and social rights, let alone the huge climate challenge that we have ahead of us. Instead of austerity cuts, we believe it is critical to create fiscal space and give governments the time, the flexibility, and the support to achieve sustainable, inclusive, and just recovery. We think that immediate and urgent steps are needed to support the financial health of country through grants and highly concessional financing, supporting debt cancellation, restructuring, and a new allocation of SDRs. Most importantly, we think that it is essential to safeguard fiscal and policy space that allows for an increase rather than a decrease in social spending. And I'd really like to continue this conversation with our esteemed speakers about this issue, particularly looking at progressive tax policy, looking at redistributive policies, which would allow redistribution of wealth fairly, and addressing specifically the heart of inequality, something that Oxfam has just addressed in a report released this week. Now, if you allow me, Stefano, I just wanted to quickly turn to the role of the World Bank, because we've just heard about of course, admirable efforts that the World Bank, along with the IMF, made to make some of the efforts possible. And we do acknowledge that the World Bank, and particularly President David Malpass, have given to the DSSI, emphasizing at every opportunity they get the need for further debt cancellation. What we are concerned with is that this really contrasts with the actual reluctance of the bank to itself participate in a debt standstill. And we understand that this reluctance stems from the fear that the bank's ratings would be downgraded, or it would reduce their ability to front-load assistance. We would argue that in previous rounds of debt cancellation, I'm particularly thinking of the MDRI initiative in 2005, the bank's participation didn't change the credit rating of the institution. We think that a debt cancellation mechanism or trust fund, similar to the IMF CCRT, which could be fully funded by donor contribution, or as a debt relief trust, such as what was set up by the MDRI, could be explored. In the case of MDRI, a trust fund to compensate multilateral institutions for their losses was created and funded through donor contributions, as well as through gold sales from the IMF and IBRD savings. Also, in this context, we could look at the issuance of SDRs. I would particularly be interested in hearing the World Bank's view on this, and look forward to the continued discussion. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you for these thoughtful contributions. So I think we've had for now our 5 speakers, their initial framing considerations. And I think there's a lot of sort of comments and questions that they have somehow posed to each other in many respects. So I'm gonna take the liberty in my role as moderator to add a little bit of dialogue among the speakers in the most immediate round before we get into another set of discussions guided by my questions. So I'm going to allow the speakers a couple of minutes to kind of react to each other if this is welcome, as I think there's been a lot of sort of cross conversations in this initial 5 intervention. So I'm actually going to start with Bander. Bander, you may want to step in, and I'm sure there are elements you may want to react or respond to, and then I will continue with the other four speakers, and then we'll get in what I was planning as a second round. Bander, floor is yours.
So thank you, Stefano, and I thank all the esteemed speakers for the insightful thoughts. I think I broadly agree with most of what has been highlighted so far, but I'm keen to react to three issues in particular. One is with regard to private sector participation in the G20 debt relief initiative, and two, the purpose of the DSSI and the link that has been established between the DSSI and the longer term sustainable development goals, and I will elaborate on this. And the third issue that you alluded to, Stefano, is the credit rating issue. I think with regard to the private sector participation, I agreed with what has been mentioned by Sarah and other speakers, that there is a need for private sector creditors to be more responsible and participate in the global efforts to address the liquidity needs in vulnerable countries during these challenging times. We have been calling private sector publicly, including through the G20 communique, to participate in the DSSI. So far, we haven't seen tangible progress in this area, but we will continue to pressure private sector to participate. And this is actually linked to, before I highlight the credit rating issue, which is very relevant to the private sector participation in the DSSI, the G20 is currently exploring a number of measures to facilitate private sector participation in the DSSI, and I can elaborate on that. But that leads me to talk about the credit rating issues, because I think it has been clarified by most or major credit rating agencies that the DSSI will not have any rating implications on borrowing countries as it currently stands. The concern, however, is about the possibility that private sector creditors may incur losses as a result of an assumed default. But however, as per the DSSI term sheet, and I think you are all aware of that, the suspension of payments will be NPV neutral. In other words, the implementation of the DSSI, as per the agreed G20 term sheet, would not result in any losses for private sector creditors. And thus, the credit rating of borrowing countries should not be impacted, and we will, of course, continue to explore ways to facilitate private sector support to vulnerable countries. The last thing I want to talk about is the purpose of the DSSI. I think I have the responsibility maybe to clarify the purpose of the DSSI. The DSSI was approved to address short-term liquidity needs related to COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, there are other financing challenges that existed even before the crisis hits. And here I'm talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And we shouldn't be confused between the purpose of the DSSI and the other measures that the G20 and the international community, including the IMF and the World Bank, should take to address the long-standing issues in development finance. So I think the Sustainable Development Goals should be addressed through additional measures, including by unlocking different sources of financing for low-income countries. And when we talk about the DSSI, I think we should look at it in the context of the overall financing package that has been deployed in response to COVID-19 pandemic, because DSSI alone does not provide the full story. We should look at the bigger picture. There are other issues that I'd like to talk about, but for the sake of time, let me stop here and would be happy to react to any additional thoughts.
Thank you so much for your consideration, Bander. And let me move on with our next speaker, Lidi. You may jump into the dialogue here.
Yes, I'd just like to start with that last point that Bander made, and that is that there has to be different forms of responses to the need that we all face. And of course, we agree with that we cannot enable and empower countries to face this multiple crisis just by one or two tracks or instruments. But so much more can be done on debt, on the problem of debt, not just the debt service, but also on the outstanding debt. And this is one problem that he also mentioned that has been going on even before COVID. And therefore, COVID provides us with an opportunity to be far more strategic and decisive in addressing this problem. But as I said in my opening round, and also one of our colleagues said that what our multiple crisis is yielding in terms of responses is putting our governments and our countries in even hotter water, in even greater distress. I could not believe when I was hearing Cristalina last night saying, for instance, that, we've narrowed down our relief to these countries, 24 or 29, because the rest of the countries can access loans from the financial markets. They're in a position to access loans from other sources. So that is how narrow, I think, the framing, it illustrates how narrow is the framing. So we're still here insisting, again, time and time again, insisting that the lenders can do much more. And for this, you have to look at the scale of need rather than the problem of paying debts. Yeah, so the countries who continue to pay, like my country, debts, because we have a law that says it should be automatically paid, and yet are staggering under the weight of the need of finances so that the needs of our people can be met for just survival, let alone for recovery. But we're not eligible because we pay our debts on time and in full. So always the starting point has been, can they pay their debts? Because if they can, then they have no problem. That's always been the starting point of all the debt relief measures that we've faced in the last 2 or 3 decades.
Thank you so much, Lidi. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Stefano. So a few points really. Firstly, Bander, in response to your point about hearing that the G20 is looking at more concrete measures around private sector participation, that's really fantastic to hear. I think this is a time for words, not actions, and I think the last 6 months has shown that asking the private sector nicely to participate is not enough. And further calls for them to participate are not enough. We need to see the G20 countries and the IMF and World Bank using the measures they have to compel participation. I'd like to pick up on this point. Both Bander and Ian mentioned the considerable lending which the IMF in particular has done in response to the crisis to developing countries. I think Ian mentioned this 100 billion figure. I think it's really important to recall, we know from historic experience that lending into debt crises just perpetuates the debt crises and does nothing to solve the situation or to support the countries in the medium or long term. So we saw this in the 1980s and 1990s, where we just saw bailout loans from the IMF and World Bank, which perpetuated the debt crises the countries were facing. But we've also seen this much more recently in relation to Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone has hardly any private sector debt. It's in debt crisis. Most of its debts are owed to either multilateral institutions or bilateral lenders. It did have debt cancelled following the Ebola crisis, but then bilateral lenders and the IFOs lent more money in order to support it to recover from an economic shock. And it hasn't recovered fully from that economic shock, and it's still in severe debt crisis. I think we really need to really see that the IFR is taking responsibility for distinguishing between lending, which will enable a country to actually pay back its debt, and lending, which will just enable a country to either service other debts or just stabilize its economy. And I think this really shows that in the context of COVID, we need debt cancellation, not simply more lending to countries.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Ian, over to you.
Thank you very much. What I would like to do first, talk a little bit about this issue of impending debt crisis and why we need to take that issue very, very seriously. I think we already shared one of our recent studies on this issue, looking at basically the kind of the current episode and examining this episode in light of what happened in the past. So while financing needs have increased significantly, financing conditions, both external and domestic, may well remain tight for most developing countries in the near term. Few countries have maintained international market access at reasonable rates, as sovereign spreads of most frontier markets remain wide. On the domestic side, markets are often insufficiently developed and therefore have limited capacity to absorb higher government borrowing. Against this background, we expect the need for liquidity support to remain high in coming years. Reconciling the need to maintain public debt at sustainable levels while meeting increased financing needs is an unprecedented challenge for developing countries. Now, a number of participants mentioned the issue of financial crisis. And in this context, the current increase in debt that started, in 2010 and actually gained momentum because of the pandemic, as many of you observed, the current bears many similarities to the previous three waves. Global interest rates have been very low since the global financial crisis, and search for yield by investors has led to the narrowing of spreads for at least some emerging and developing economies. To understand the consequences of rapid debt accumulation episodes, like the one we have been going through, we examine previous such episodes at the country level. Since 1970, we identify about 520 national episodes of rapid private and public debt accumulation in 100 emerging and developing economies. About half of these episodes eventually were accompanied by financial crises that led to severe output losses compared to those countries without financial crisis. After 8 years, GDP and GDP per capita were around 6 to 10% lower in crisis episodes, while investment was around 15 to 22% lower. Now, what should be done and what are the solutions we have? Obviously, debt service suspension is an important stopgap, but it is not enough. First, as I mentioned and many participants mentioned, too many of the creditors are not participating, leaving the debt relief too shallow to meet the fiscal needs of the pandemic in the poorest countries. Second, debt payments are simply being deferred, not reduced. It doesn't translate the kind of the light at the end of the debt tunnel. This is particularly apparent in today's low for long financing environment. The risk is that it will take years or decades for the poorest countries to convince creditors to reduce their debt burdens enough to basically muster a durable recovery. Given the depth of the pandemic, we need to move with urgency to provide a meaningful reduction in the stock of debt for countries in debt distress. I'm happy to get into the what we need in the next segment. to deliver that type of debt stress.
Thank you so much, Ian. Let me move to Jean to hear her views on this initial dialogue. Jean, over to you.
Thanks, Stefano. I think the panelists have raised a number of issues, and I particularly appreciate, obviously, the World Bank's data publications. It has been very helpful, and the warnings that it gives about a debt crisis. I think it certainly aligns with our concerns about the issues. And like I mentioned in the previous round, particularly concerns about austerity and how this will probably contribute to the next debt crisis or the ongoing debt crisis is a huge issue that must be addressed. 500 organizations or more than 500 organizations have recently published a statement raising this issue, really addressing how austerity, the reduction of public expenditure, increase of direct taxes is going to be impacting a country's capacity to, first of all, deal with the immediate crisis, and secondly, to address the medium to long-term development challenges as well as the climate chaos that we face. But I would particularly kind of zero in on the issue of the role of credit rating agencies. It came up. I do think that the role that they are playing as bullies needs to be properly addressed. What's on the table is far from sufficient. In the past, we have seen, for instance, the EU reining in on credit rating agencies. Countries have been bullied not to participate in the current initiatives being offered because of their fear of credit rating agencies. As a result, they've had to lend at much more expensive rates, either at the domestic markets or in the financial markets. This is something that is only compounding the problem, and just throwing up our hands and saying that we can't do anything about it is not a sustainable solution. I'll leave it at that. I would like to come back to the issue of debt sustainability that Liddy raised, but I'll come to that in the next round.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thanks to all the panelists for this initial dialogue. So let me move to the next round. And as I do it, let me also encourage those in the audience to pose their comments and questions again in the chat, because we may pick on them as they come through. Now, there was a very interesting editorial, which it doesn't get out of my mind. No, its title was "We're all in the same storm, but we're not on the same boat." And I think that's a very, very good, example of our situation. It's clear that there are boats that have different capabilities of navigating these particular circumstances. And in a way, you can generalize this. It's not only because of COVID. Our development challenges certainly they were huge and growing far before COVID has started its impact. So we don't need to necessarily relate everything to COVID. But the reality is that this is a major storm, as we've heard from some of the speakers, and the capacity of countries is very different. There's been a lot of focus on flows of resources, flows of goods, flows of commodities, food, health, supplies, but very little emphasis on recognizing that the reason why some boats are incapable of navigating the storm is related to structural systemic issues of the way in which our global division of labor, our global macroeconomic frameworks are structured. So when we look at debt, it's important that, yes, we zoom in the condition of particular countries, but at the same time, it's also important that we zoom out and we try and recognize which are the systemic determinants that can actually contribute to the debt crisis. And some of the speakers have already hinted at some of this, the macroeconomic conditions, the low interest rates, and the bubble of hot money that also has been the consequence of the way in which some countries have actually responded to the last financial crisis. but therefore, this also calls to systemic reforms. Systemic reforms in terms of rules, in terms of norms, policies, but also in terms of institutions that are urgently required. And there is a tendency of always putting the systemic reform in the long term. And there's been the one economist we all know, Mr. Keynes, has suggested that in the long term we shall all be dead. So this is precisely the moment in which certain changes have to happen, and we don't necessarily need to use the comfort zone of the long term to kick difficult reforms away. So I want to challenge our speakers here and invite them to elaborate more, on one hand, on the systemic determinants of our debt challenges, and on the other, on the kind of systemic reforms which are urgently necessary in order to confront these circumstances. Bander, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And let me, before I answer this excellent question, say that I completely agree with what you mentioned. And our job as the presidency of the G20 is to make sure that we are actually on the same boat as we face this storm, because our effort is to support the consensus building efforts. And the decision-making process in the G20 is based on the consensus, and that requires extensive negotiation, because we might agree on the common objectives, but we might have different views on how to achieve these common objectives. So we will continue to make sure that we are on the same boat as we continue to face this crisis. But let me focus on debt developments following the current crisis, and how several work streams are operationalized to help mitigate future debt sustainability challenges. I'll provide some background before I elaborate on this point. And I believe some speaker alluded to this. According to the IMF, around half of low-income countries, and here we are talking about 36 low-income countries, are at high risk of debt distress, or actually in debt distress, even before the crisis hits. And therefore, it's important to understand the current debt challenges in the context of the vulnerabilities that pre-existed the current crisis. Many countries were exhibiting weak fiscal discipline practices due to fragile macroeconomic framework, as well as public financial management policies, which contributed to debt sustainability risks. But I'm not going to elaborate on this because some speaker already spoke about it. But I believe these conditions exacerbate the current challenges, which squeeze the already limited financing options for low-income countries. And I believe one of the main issues that led to such scenario is the lack of transparency, which is a shared responsibility by both debtor and creditors, including the private sector. And I believe the speaker from the World Bank alluded to that important point. There are, however, some initiatives to promote best practices in this regard. For instance, the G20 operational guidelines for sustainable financing aim to enhance access to sound financing for development, while ensuring that sovereign debt remains on a sustainable path by enhancing capacity and fostering information sharing among borrowers, creditors, and international financial institutions. Also, to enhance transparency in private sector lending, particularly to the most vulnerable low-income countries, the G20 has been engaged with private sector through the IIF to articulate the voluntary principle for debt transparency. But of course, efforts need to continue to address the remaining data gap and improve fiscal transparency, which will, of course, in turn facilitate better governance and support debt sustainability. But having said that, we do have to recognize that there are capacity issues in the low-income countries. And you rightly highlighted that, Stefano, that different countries have different capacity levels, and we have to be mindful of that. And here we should continue to call on the relevant development partners, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, to step up their efforts to provide targeted technical assistance that meets the specific demands of developing countries, because at the end of the day, there is no one size fits all. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Bandar. Lidi, over to you.
Thanks, Stefano. You know, the logic of borrowing seems fairly simple enough, or the logic of lending. Here are countries, they are poor, they need resources, and we have resources from the point of view of lenders. So here we are making it available as loans. Or from the point of view of our governments, we're poor, we don't have enough money, and here are the lenders and creditors, and they're offering us loans. So let's not jeopardize that by actually admitting that we have a debt problem. But again, this is a very myopic way and very deliberate, I think, on the part of lenders and borrowers' way of presenting the problem. The problem is much greater, it's systemic. The first question is, why are we poor? Why are we impoverished? We have been in this perpetual state of impoverishment, and it's just getting worse. But we keep also raising, as civil society, that part of the problem is how our economies are structured. So we need to address the flaws in our domestic economies, which are oriented for the global market, which is keep getting us caught up in a race to the bottom as far as the prices of our goods are concerned and the cost of our labor. We're trying to sell our labor as cheaply and cheaper than our neighbors, because we're all in competition for the same thing. It's also kind of economies where there is much more bias for foreign investments and multinational corporations. And therefore, they dominate our economies, and we see a net outflow of resources out of the South. And that is why we are poor. And that is why we are being told we need these loans. That's why we're being told we need fiscal discipline so that the creditors will give you access to financing. So unless we break this pattern, and let me just say, not just the domestic economies, but the whole structure of the global economy, where there's such unfair trade, where there is unregulated, undisciplined flow of capital that just plunders different countries and leave when they want to, after they've made their money. And this again has been systemic issues we've been raising in various fora. The need to control capital flows, the need to regulate in favor of the interests of people and communities and of nature. But we have not made the progress that we should make. I'm not talking about some of the mechanisms we've been talking about regarding debt, because I'm sure my colleagues will be talking about that. So I'd like to emphasize that the problem of the debt is beyond just the question of access to financing, capital, or whether we have financing inside, or liquidity, or insolvency. And I'm sure there's such great economists in these institutions that are just refusing to show the picture as it is, a bigger picture than just question of credit, insolvency, liquidity, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, Lidi, for this very, very clear, crystal clear, I would say, zooming out or where the bigger dynamics are in the global division of labor. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Stefano. So we very much believe that it was a failure of the rich countries and the international institutions to tackle these structural and systemic issues underlying the last round of debt crises in the 1980s and 90s. That's the reason why we're again facing a new round of debt crisis in the global south. We have, I think, a very different view as to what the most important structural issues are compared to the shared G20 analysis that Banda just communicated. Our analysis, like Liddy's, I think, is very much grounded in an understanding of the massive inequalities in power and resources that exist in the global economy, and an understanding of the rules and processes which rich countries like my country, the UK, have put in place and used to maintain and increase actually those inequalities in power and resources. So we think it's useful to think about these structural issues as grouped into two different sets. Firstly, there's the set which basically underpin the dependency of developing countries on debt-based financing. And then there's the second, which underlie the reckless and often exploitative lending, which is such a key driver of debt crises. So in terms of that first set, the ones that underpin debt dependency, Liddy has really touched on these. We have all of the structural process like tax avoidance and evasion, other illicit finance flows, the repatriation of profits by multinational companies, and then the unfair trade rules in the global trade regime, which keep developing countries locked into the production of low value manufactured goods and also low value raw material extraction. So these collectively, these factors lead to a massive ongoing outflow of financial resources from developing countries and increase the reliance of developing countries on debt as a form of financing for things like healthcare, social protection, and basic public services. I think maybe Jean will talk more about the tax justice issue, but one estimate suggests that Africa alone loses $240 billion a year in government revenue just because of tax avoidance and tax evasion. And then we have the second set of factors which underpin the reckless and exploitative lending, which serves to cause and perpetuate debt crises. So we're here under that set of factors. We have basically the things which enable the high risk and corrupt lending to take place, lack of regulation in the global financial centres, particularly the UK and New York, including both regulations to require responsible lending, which we used to have in place in the sort of 1970s and 80s, but also regulations around transparency so that people in borrowing countries can actually find out what debts their government are taking on in their name. The lack of an internationally agreed bankruptcy process for countries, because there is no formal multilateral bankruptcy for process. This means that debt crises are resolved really at the mercy of lenders. If there's a massive power imbalance between lenders and borrowers in that process of resolving debt crises, and that creates moral hazard in the system, which enables irresponsible and reckless lending. And then finally, you have also the fact that the IMF doesn't follow its own policy to require restructuring of debts in a debt crisis. And this is another factor, basically, which creates moral hazard. So it allows and enables the bailing out of reckless lenders. We conducted some research in 2019, which found that the IMF was spending $93 billion bailing out reckless lenders in 18 countries. So that's another big factor. So altogether, these factors create moral hazards in the system. They allow and incentivize reckless lending. And we strongly believe that now is the time for the international community to act on these structural issues. We need urgent debt cancellation to provide countries with resources to actually tackle the immediate impacts of COVID. But unless we tackle these structural issues, unless we bring in an international bankruptcy process, unless we tackle these enablers of irresponsible and exploitative lending, then we'll be finding ourselves back here again in 5-10 years' time and on a repeat cycle, basically, indefinitely.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Ian, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to focus on two points in this round to address I think there's two questions really we need to have a good grasp of. The first one is, what are the necessary steps that are needed today to overcome the current debt challenges in these poorest developing economies? First, as I already mentioned, full participation in the DSSI by all official, bilateral, and commercial creditors needed to really buy time. Second, full transparency of the terms of the existing and new debt and debt-like commitments of the governments of the poor countries. Both creditors and debtors should embrace this transparency, but we think that neither has done enough in this regard. Third, there is no question we need new tools to push forward with the reduction of the stock of debt for the poorest countries. The World Bank and IMF are proposing to the Development Committee a joint action plan by the end of 2020 for debt reduction for either countries in unsustainable debt situations. Now, we have been discussing some solutions. Let me talk a little bit about what are the consequences of inaction at this critical juncture. The previous waves of debt ended with widespread financial crisis. When debt resolution was protracted, growth was often slow to recover or even resulted in a lost decade of growth. Let me first talk about the financial crisis. As I mentioned, we are experiencing the fourth wave of debt since 1970. The three previous waves all ended with widespread crisis. The first global wave of debt spanned the 70s and 80s, with borrowing by governments in Latin America and low-income countries, sub-Saharan Africa. This wave saw a series of financial crises in the early 80s. The second wave ran from 1990 until the early 2000s, as banks and corporations in East Asia and the Pacific and governments in Europe and Central Asia borrowed heavily. And this wave ended with a series of crises in these regions in 1997 to 2001. The third wave was a run-up in private sector borrowing in Europe and Central Asia, which ended when the global financial crisis disrupted bank financing in 2007 to 2009 and tipped several economies into sharp recessions. There is a risk that the fourth wave that is currently underway also ends with a major financial crisis, with some countries already experiencing that distress. Now, if we don't do what is necessary, another outcome could be protracted resolution. During the first wave of debt, widespread sovereign debt defaults in Latin America and low-income countries in the early 1980s took many years to be resolved. Debt relief only took place in Latin America with the Brady Plan in 1989, while in low-income countries, meaningful debt relief did not take place until the HIPC and MDRI schemes in 1996 and 2005, respectively. In contrast, during the second and third waves of debt, which chiefly involved the private sector, debt resolution was achieved more rapidly, but at substantial cost to governments that frequently assisted through bank recapitalization and other support schemes. Another issue we should seriously remember is the lost decade of growth when we had these episodes before. Prolonged periods of debt restructuring in previous waves were associated with a lost decade of growth, for example, in Latin America and in low-income countries, frequently negative per capita income growth. The pandemic is likely to magnify a slowdown in output and investment growth that has already been underway for a decade. I just circulated a publication on this issue. You can see it on the chat. Weak growth will further increase debt burdens and erode borrowers' ability to service debt in the poorest countries. For some countries in debt distress, the economic output may only improve once debt relief in the form of debt write-off take place rather than reschedule. There is no easy solution when you think about debt resolution. When you look at the past experience, eventually high debt may need to resolve in one or more of 6 ways: growth, fiscal austerity, privatization, unexpected inflation, often in combination with financial repression, debt relief, and taxing wealth. As many of these participants observe, each of these options is associated with challenging trade-offs, such that choices need to be carefully tailored to country circumstances. So inaction is not an option.
Thank you so much, Ian, and we're beginning to get close to the final round. So, Jean, over to you for your remarks in this round, and then I will invite everyone for one closing minute for your final pitch, or should you want to pick on something important that the others have said. Jean, over to you.
Thanks very much. Very quickly to add to what was said about the structural issues. An additional structural issue, I think Sarah already mentioned it, is on the one hand, the fact that the current standstill in global tax governance is basically reducing the capacity of countries to raise revenues. Illicit financial flows have still not been addressed sufficiently. The governance structures right now within a closed club of essentially countries that are hosting the biggest tax havens in the world is not working. I think these are issues that need to be addressed in structural ways. Additional structural issue I would address is indeed the faultiness of lending design. I would specifically point to the World Bank's maximizing financing for development approach, in which we have found that the tendency to favor lending to the private sector is a fundamentally flawed approach and really needs to be reviewed to ensure that development finance is really contributing to poverty eradication. But let me, as I mentioned earlier, I would really like to zero in on the issue of debt sustainability. I think that Lydie raised a very, very valid point when she says that poor countries tend to focus on and tend to prioritize repaying their debts, servicing their debts, rather than really addressing their country's needs with regard to their human rights obligations, sustainable development expenditure, and kind of justly responding to the climate crisis. I think this really responds to a fundamental bug in the way that debt is dealt with in international financial institutions. It's a failure right at the core of the framework to determine debt sustainability. From its inception in the 1950s, the framework of debt sustainability used by the IMF and the World Bank have been grounded in the assessment of the commitments of governments to adjust domestic resource use to levels compatible with meeting creditors' claims, rather than responding to actual needs of their country. We would actually be calling, and this has been something that the UN independent rapporteurs have been calling for many, many years, we would be calling for a totally different approach to debt sustainability, one which puts human rights, the achievement of the SDGs, and climate financing right at the center of the debt sustainability framework. Another critical issue is about restructuring. I don't think we've spent enough of time talking about this. We have seen an interesting call in the last week or so from the IMF for restructuring to be much more on the agenda. This is a very interesting approach, but we would only stress that the current circumstances where we don't have a level playing field, pushing countries to engage one by one separately with each creditor, and particularly private creditors, in restructuring negotiations as a condition to access an additional tranche of emergency financing is absolutely unjust. What we need is a much more level playing field in the form of an independent, a structured, a predictable debt workout mechanism within the auspices of the UN. We do call for a process where countries can negotiate new structures in this regard. But I'll keep that for the end if we have time.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jean. So I think we are getting to the end of this session, unfortunately, because there will be so much to continue discussing. I'm going to ask you to just provide one very short, maximum 1 minute final pitch on the basis of the discussion so far. Bander, first of all, over to you.
Thank you, Stefano. I must say, if I only have 1 minute, that I agree with Sarah and Lydie that addressing the situation of debt sustainability or debt vulnerabilities should not be only addressed through finding additional debt financing for low-income countries, but also through additional sources of financing beyond debt. So I agree with them, given the high financing need and debt vulnerabilities in developing countries, including low-income countries. Sure, efforts should focus on unlocking additional sources of financing beyond external debt. And here, let me highlight 3 areas that the G20 is currently working on. One, the development of domestic capital market with a view to help countries reduce reliance on external debt and implement counter-cyclical policy to finance their deficit. It also helps firms, including SMEs, to access finance and thus contribute to the equality issue. The second area we are focusing on is mobilizing domestic resources through better management of public resources. And the last issue is extremely important, which is related to crowding in private sector investments in developing countries. The challenge here we face is that investment risks in those countries are classified to be high, as you know, and therefore we are working with multilateral development banks, including the World Bank, who to offer additional guarantees and incentives, including political risk insurance, to promote greater private sector investment in developing countries. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Bander. Lydie, over to you.
You know, in recent years, there's been a lot of talk about South-South solidarity within the multilateral process. And I'd like to just leave kind of like an idea of interpreting it in a different way. Today, one of those in crisis is actually capital. There's so much capital, and they're looking for ways on how to invest it. I think the Southern countries should get together and use the leverage that they have, that this capital is searching for ways to get in our countries. That's why it's being lent so readily now. And we need to get the Southern governments and the Southern countries together so that we can relate from a position of strength, relate to capital and the elites and the rich countries and the lenders from a position of strength. It's not just about how we are going to provide each other funds in the name of South-South solidarity, but it's about leveraging our power together.
Thank you so much, Lydie. And as I move on to Sarah, I think I will forego my final remarks because I think you have an announcement to make about something that starts today, So I'll give over to you for that last 1 minute close. Sarah, over to you.
I'm not actually sure about that announcement, Stefano, which one you were talking about. If it's okay, I would use, we are publishing some research, but it's actually tomorrow about the role that the IMF can play in unlocking a multilateral debt restructuring process using its resources, using the profit that's been made from its gold reserves and also from the SDRs. So keep an eye out for that paper tomorrow. If it's okay, I'll actually conclude just by very briefly picking up this point about credit ratings agencies. We believe that the real issue isn't so much actually that credit ratings agencies are bullies, but actually that the private lenders are hiding behind the credit ratings agencies in order to avoid suspending or cancelling debt in response to this crisis. So there's this concern which is being articulated that if private lenders are required to cancel debts to lower income countries, then lower income countries will not be able to access private international finance. We think this concern is highly misplaced for 2 reasons. Firstly, if debt payments are cancelled, then in the short term, countries won't need actually to access the international private market. So sure, there may be an impact on credit ratings, but it won't matter to countries because they will have more fiscal space. Second, there's lots of evidence that in the medium term, if a country's debts are restructured, it's actually that restructuring which enables them to access the international financial markets at more affordable rates. So there's IMF research from 2013, from 2020, and research from the Store Credit Ratings Agency in September this year, which all points towards that. So let's be aware of the extent to which private lenders are using this scaremongering to avoid cancelling debt payments. And let's hope that the G20 really steps up next week and takes responsibility for the role of the private sector in this crisis. Let's remember that most of these private banks and hedge funds are based in the UK, the US, and the European countries. Let's hope that the G20 takes responsibility for this and announces measures next week which compel that private sector participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Over to Ian.
Let me first thank the organizer again for giving us an opportunity to join. We always would like to interact with the representatives of civil society. I'm going to talk about debt transparency in this concluding round. Debt transparency is a critical aspect of debt sustainability and of an efficient framework for avoiding and addressing unsustainable situations going forward. Full information on the funds borrowed, the terms and conditions of public debt, as well as the stakeholders involved, is all crucial to obtain a proper picture of the debt problem, to detect solvency or liquidity issues early on, and to effectively resolve them when needed. This means that creditors must refrain from excessive conditionality clauses. Full information is not only important regarding the funds borrowed, but also on how they are used, particularly during this pandemic, when countries' space to borrow is limited and the need for efficient growth enhancing investment is high. We really need to understand how these funds borrow. Full debt transparency would not only help to avoid negative debt surprises and facilitate orderly debt workouts, but it also promotes sustainable lending practices. And it allows citizens to hold both borrowers and creditors accountable. The World Bank is supporting debt transparency through many channels by publishing comprehensive debt statistics and providing information on debt reporting by countries through technical assistance and by incentivizing debt transparency reforms and through creditor outreach. Let me say, civil society can play a critical role in calling for and supporting debt and investment transparency. Thank you again. It was a fascinating session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jean, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, let me say on transparency that actually civil society has been calling for transparency and for publicly accessible registries of loan and debt and debt data for many, many years for all lenders and borrowers. So we certainly welcome that information and hope that it will be accessible. Finally, I mean, let me just say that obviously, indeed, we are in a storm together, but on very different kinds of boats. And some of the boats are very, very leaky and almost sinking at the moment. But as Antonio Guterres said, debt alleviation of the developing world is not only in the interest of developing countries, it is in the interest of everybody. So I think that there is an immediate and urgent need for action, and much greater action, much more ambitious action, and much more thought through action than we've seen this year, although that is welcome. But I do call at this point of time, and based on all that has been said, for an opportunity when countries and when we can meet each other and talk face to face once again. I just want to raise this call for convening UN Economic Reconstruction and Systemic Reform Summit, because this is a systemic crisis. It's not going to go away. Probably it will come back and rebound in our face. It is necessary to talk about systemic solutions once and for all. Let's catch the bull by the horns and ensure that along with a vaccine for the virus, there will also be a race against the clock to save ourselves from the eternal curse of inequality and climate injustice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I will save you from any closing remark other than echoing what Jean has just said in the need to really look at systemic reforms. And therefore, I want to echo the call by civil society and the Civil Society Financing for Development Group, more particularly for this international economic reconstruction and systemic reform summit within the United Nations. It's really the one moment in which we need a new global consensus to allow socio-economic transformation of developing countries and therefore remove the systemic obstacles that the global economic frameworks actually put on countries in order to prevent their capacity to advance. But in this, I'd like to therefore ask Lydie for the very last word of this very fascinating discussion, because I think she has an important action announcement to make. So Lydie, over to you for the last word.
Yeah, I'd just like to share with everyone that many of us here in this panel and so many other groups and movements across the world are observing a global week of action for debt cancellation, which begins today. We have many actions in different continents and regions. One in particular, I'd like to invite you all to join us in an international concert, online concert on October 14, where we will celebrate the power of people and loudly call for debt justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and goodbye, everyone. Thanks for having participated to this excellent conversation, and a special thanks to all the speakers. Thank you. Bye-bye.